I pulled into the driveway of the house I had bought in absolute silence. It was a mid-century modern gem tucked into the slopes of Forest Heights in Oregon, defined by its floor-to-ceiling glass walls. Those walls were designed to let nature in. Instead, tonight they framed a horror show. Inside my living room, a room I had not even slept in yet, stood my mother Linda and my sister-in-law Paige. They were not knocking. They were not waiting on the porch. My mother was holding a yellow tape measure against the window frame. She was not visiting. She was measuring for curtains. They had broken into my sanctuary before I even turned the key. I didn't honk. I didn't storm the front door screaming about boundaries or respect. That would have been a reaction, and I was done reacting. I shifted my car into reverse and backed out of the driveway as quietly as I had arrived. I drove 2 blocks down, parked under the heavy shade of a cedar tree, and opened the security app on my phone. I watched them on the small screen like a surveillance operator. My mother moved through the rooms with the confidence of an owner inspecting the finish on the floors. Paige pointed at the kitchen island, her mouth moving in a rhythm of criticism I knew by heart. I waited. Time wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in the gradual restoration of my control. They stayed for 21 minutes. Once their taillights disappeared down the winding road, I drove back. Walking into my own home felt like walking into a crime scene that only I could see. The air felt heavy, contaminated by entitlement. I didn't cry. I didn't call them to ask how they got a key. I knew the answer was irrelevant. The breach was the only fact that mattered. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number for a 24-hour emergency locksmith. I requested commercial-grade smart locks with biometric access. I wasn't securing a house. I was fortifying a perimeter. While I waited for the technician, I cleaned. I didn't just wipe surfaces. I sterilized them. I scrubbed the window frame where my mother's tape measure had rested. I mopped the floors where Paige's heels had clicked. It wasn't housekeeping. It was an exorcism. I was erasing their unauthorized footprints from the ecosystem I had built. The locksmith arrived within the hour. He was efficient, asking few questions, sensing the voltage in the air. He drilled, replaced, and programmed. When he finished, he handed me the master keycard. I closed the heavy front door and engaged the electronic deadbolt. Click. That sound was the loudest thing I had heard all day. It was mechanical, final, and perfect. It was the sounds of a guillotine blade dropping on a lifetime of open-door policies. It was the sounds of a boundary finally, physically snapping shut. I sat down in the center of the living room floor. My greyhound, Echo, padded over and curled up beside me, his long, lean body a warm weight against my leg. The room was empty. There was no furniture yet, just moonlight filtering through the glass walls I had paid for with 6 years of missed holidays, freelance contracts, and instant noodles. There's a specific texture to the silence of a room that you own completely. It doesn't hum with the anxiety of a landlord's inspection or the friction of a roommate's schedule. It is a vacuum. It contains only what you invited in. No noise, no demands, no history. Just the silence you paid for. It tasted like cold water after a long run. I leaned my head back against the wall, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady breathing of my dog. They thought this house was a family asset to be shared. Tonight, behind this new steel bolt, I was correcting the ledger. People ask why I had to keep a $600,000 asset a secret. They ask why I couldn't just tell my parents I was moving out. They don't understand the economics of the Caldwell family. In my family, assets were not owned by individuals. They were resources to be harvested and reallocated to the person with the loudest needs. And for 32 years, that person was my brother Evan. Evan was what my mother called a visionary and what the banks called a high-risk liability. He was a startup founder, which in his case meant great hair, a persuasive smile, and a long history of ventures that evaporated into mist. He didn't build things, he pitched them. I was the opposite. I was a landscape architect. I dealt in soil drainage, root systems, and hardscapes. My world was defined by gravity and physics. If a retaining wall wasn't built correctly, the earth moved. There was no talking your way out of a mudslide. While Evan was networking in Scottsdale or pitching vapor apps in Austin, I was on job sites at 6 in the morning wearing steel-toed boots, making sure the foundation held. We were assigned our roles early. Evan was the star, I was the stagehand. When Evan totaled his car at 17, my parents bought him a new one so his image wouldn't suffer. When I needed a laptop for college, I was given a lecture on the virtue of part-time work. I didn't resent the work. The work made me sharp. It made me dangerous. Over the last 6 years, I took every high-end commission I could find. I designed meditation courtyards for tech executives and sustainable terraces for boutique hotels. I didn't take vacations. I didn't buy designer clothes. I funneled every cent into a high-yield savings account my mother didn't know existed. I saved $115,000. Meanwhile, Evan was burning through family capital. He had cash flow issues. He had bridge loans from my father that never found the other side of the river. I watched my parents refinance their own home twice to fund his seed rounds. They didn't see it as enabling. They saw it as investing in the family legacy. That was the trap. In their eyes, my success wasn't mine. It was a surplus. If I had money, it meant the family had money, which meant Evan had money, which meant Evan had a safety net. If I bought this house openly, it wouldn't have been my home. It would have been the Caldwell guest house. It would have been a landing pad for Evan when his latest venture inevitably collapsed. I looked around my living room. The glass walls didn't just offer a view of the Douglas firs. They offered clarity. This house wasn't just property. It was a firewall. I bought it to prove that I existed outside their ecosystem. I wasn't the utility player anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and I was finished building safety nets for people who refused to learn how to fall. The next morning, the sun hit the glass walls at a perfect 45-degree angle, illuminating dust motes dancing in the empty space. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee, watching the light. For a moment, it felt like the peace I had paid for. Then, my phone vibrated against the quartz counter. It wasn't an apology. In the Caldwell family, apologies were treated like structural defects. It was a text from my mother, Linda. "So glad we finally saw the investment property. It has great bones, though the glass is a bit exposed. Paige thinks the lower level is perfect for Evan's soft landing. While he pivots, we can move his boxes in Saturday. Let's discuss rent. We're thinking a family rate is fair since you're building equity." I stared at the screen. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold fascination of a scientist observing a newly discovered virus. She didn't see a break-in. She saw a site visit. She didn't see my home. She saw a family asset I was temporarily holding, like a shell company. This was the architecture of a narcissistic family system. In my mother's mind, we were not separate individuals with boundaries and property rights. We were organs in the same body. If the hand picked an apple, the mouth, Evan, had the right to eat it. The hand didn't get to hoard the apple. That would be a malfunction. That would be cancer. To Linda, my bank account was just a reservoir for the family trust. And right now, Evan was in a drought. She had convinced herself that I had bought this $600,000 house specifically to solve Evan's latest failure. In her reality, I was a property manager, she was the CEO, Evan was the talent. A voicemail came in seconds later. It was Linda again, her voice lowered to that conspiratorial whisper she used when planning a takeover. "Don't be dramatic about the key. We needed to measure because Evan's lease is up on the 1st. He's going through a hard time with the business, and he needs a place that projects success. This house is perfect for his image. We're all pitching in. You provide the housing, we'll handle his groceries. It's a family trust effort." Family trust effort. The phrase was a masterclass in gaslighting. There was no trust. There was only my savings, my credit score, and my name on the deed. But to them, my autonomy was an act of aggression. By locking the door, I wasn't protecting myself. I was stealing from the collective. I typed a reply. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. I didn't debate his image. This is not an investment property. This is my primary residence. Evan is not moving in. Do not come back to this address. The response was immediate. The typing dots jumped like an erratic heartbeat. "You are hoarding assets while your brother is drowning. I didn't raise you to be selfish. We're coming Saturday to move him in. Unlock the door or we'll have a locksmith do it for us. It's family property." I set the phone down. The morning light suddenly felt cold. They weren't going to stop. They genuinely believed they owned me and, by extension, the house. Text messages weren't enough. Locks weren't enough. They were operating under the laws of the Caldwell family, where the golden child consumed and the scapegoat absorbed the cost. I needed to drag them into a different jurisdiction. I didn't reply. Texts were their weapon, emotional, fast, deniable. I needed paper. I needed the law. I needed to stop acting like a daughter and start acting like a landlord facing a hostile takeover. I sat at my drafting table, the same place I usually design drainage solutions and elevation changes. That morning, I was designing an exit strategy. I called a property attorney I had worked with on a zoning dispute the year before. He was expensive, precise, and indifferent to family harmony. I need a formal notice against trespass drafted immediately, I said, and a cease and desist regarding harassment via electronic communication. I want them served by a process server. I want it to be unignorable. He didn't ask why. He asked for names and addresses. I gave him Linda's, my father's Mark's, and Evan's. Saying those names felt like cutting a cable that had been holding up my life. For decades, my loyalty had been the primary load-bearing structure. I had reinforced their egos, patched their cracks, and absorbed the floodwaters of their disasters. While I waited for the draft, I opened a fresh legal pad. I needed to do a different kind of math. In economics, there's a concept called opportunity cost, the loss incurred by choosing one option over another. For years, I had chosen loyalty. I started listing the cost. Not just the money I'd lent Evan that vanished into failed ventures, the compounded interest of my own erasure. Cost: 3 years of therapy to unlearn the belief that having needs was selfish. Cost: panic attacks in the guest bathroom every Thanksgiving because I couldn't fix the turkey fast enough. Cost: relationships I sabotaged because I didn't know how to be loved without being useful. Cost: the silence, the hours spent shrinking so Evan could take up more space. I stared at the list. I had been paying a subscription fee for affection that didn't exist. I had treated their approval like a premium asset when it was actually a depreciating liability. The price of my freedom was their disapproval. I reviewed the emotional balance sheet. It was a bargain. The printer came to life, spitting out the legal documents. The language was cold, sterile, and beautiful. You are hereby notified that you are forbidden from entering the premises. It stripped away titles. It reduced them to what they were, individuals threatening my peace. I signed my name. The pen scraped against the paper, sharp and final. I wasn't just signing a notice. I was signing a declaration of independence. I slid the papers into a manila envelope. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, like ballast being cut free. I was just printing address labels when my phone rang, an international number. My younger sister, Rachel. "You need to listen carefully," she said, her voice tight through the static. "I just talked to Dad. He was drunk. He told me something. They sold the cabin." I froze. The cabin was a small cedar A-frame in the Cascades my grandfather had built. It wasn't worth millions, but it was the one asset they had always promised would be mine, my designated inheritance, the thing meant to balance the scales. "What do you mean they sold it?" "They sold it 6 months ago. Evan got into some crypto scheme, something called Novamint or whatever. He lost everything. He was leveraged for $240,000. They sold the cabin to cover his margin calls." The room tilted. I gripped the drafting table. Why didn't they tell me? "Because they needed somewhere to put him," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "Dad said the plan was to move him into your new house so they wouldn't have to admit to anyone at the club that he was broke. They were going to tell everyone he bought a place in Forest Heights. They were going to use your house to launder his reputation." I ended the call. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't calm. It vibrated. This wasn't entitlement. This was theft. They had liquidated my inheritance to bail out the golden child, and then they had tried to seize my personal property to hide the evidence. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a cover-up. They weren't just bad parents. They were co-conspirators in a financial crime against my future. I looked at the legal documents on my desk. The notice against trespass suddenly felt inadequate, like a fly swatter when I needed a sledgehammer. I picked up my phone and called the attorney back. "Add a paragraph," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. "I want a formal inquiry into the status of the Cascade Ridge Cabin Trust, and I want a forensic accounting of all family assets I'm listed as a beneficiary on. If they sold that cabin without my signature on the trust release, that's fraud. That's a declaration of war," he warned. "No," I said, "it's discovery." I looked out through the glass walls as the sun slid down behind the firs, throwing long shadows across the lawn. They had taken my past. They had sold my memories to cover Evan's gambling addiction dressed up as investing, but they weren't going to take my future. I wasn't just locking them out. I was about to burn the bridge while they were still standing on it. Saturday morning arrived with the low, grinding rumble of a diesel engine. I stood in the kitchen drinking tea, watching the driveway. I had expected them. Narcissists don't believe in boundaries. They believe in tests of will. They thought if they showed up with enough momentum, I would fold. They were betting on my shame. They were betting I would choose compliance over a scene in a quiet upscale neighborhood. They were wrong. I wasn't afraid of a scene. I had curated one. A 26-foot moving truck backed into my driveway, air brakes hissing like a warning. Evan jumped out of the passenger side wearing designer sunglasses, barking orders at the driver, performing success like a role he'd memorized. My mother Linda pulled in behind the truck, her trunk popping open, probably packed with groceries for the pantry she felt entitled to stock. They moved with the arrogant efficiency of people who had never been told no. Evan walked up the driveway and reached for the front door. He expected it to open. He expected me to be inside, ready to resume my role as his safety net. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, then locked it behind me. I wasn't in pajamas. I was in a tailored suit, a manila envelope in my hand. "Open the garage," he shouted, not even looking at me. "The driver's on the clock." "You need to move the truck," I said. My voice was quiet. It didn't need volume. The glass and stone carried every word. Linda marched up the steps, her mouth fixed into a tight managerial smile. "We are not doing this today. We are moving your brother in. We sold the cabin to fix his mess, and you are going to do your part. Unlock the door before the neighbors start staring." "The neighbors are already looking," I said, pointing toward the street. 2 patrol cars rolled to the curb, lights flashing silently in the morning sun. I had called the non-emergency line an hour earlier and reported an anticipated trespassing incident involving aggressive family members. I requested a standby presence to keep the peace. The officers walked up the driveway. Evan froze. The startup founder mask slipped, revealing the terrified child beneath. Linda looked from the police to me, stunned. In her world, you didn't call the police on family. In her world, you let them take what they wanted. "Officer," I said, stepping forward, "these individuals have been served with a formal notice against trespass and a cease and desist. They are attempting to force entry into my primary residence." I handed him the certified documents. He scanned them, checked the deed, then looked at Evan. "Is this your property, sir?" "It's family property," Evan stammered. "My sister bought it for—" "The deed is in her name," the officer cut in, "and this notice says you are not welcome here. You need to remove this truck immediately or you will be cited for trespassing." The silence that followed was heavy and precise. Evan looked to Linda, waiting for her to explain that he was special, that rules bent for him. Linda stared at me instead. She saw the new locks, she saw the papers, she saw for the first time that I wasn't her daughter in this moment. I was a stranger who knew her secrets. "Please," she hissed, her voice shaking, "don't do this to your brother." "I didn't do anything," I said. "I bought a house. You sold the cabin. You made your choices." The officer turned to the driver. "Back it out, now." The reverse alarm sounded, beep, 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 echoing through Forest Heights. It was the sound of retreat. It was the sound of delusion backing out of my reality. I stood on the porch as they scrambled into their vehicles, small and humiliated. The power dynamic didn't shift. It evaporated. They had no leverage. They had no cabin. And now they had no landing pad. The silence that settled over the neighborhood was different from the silence I'd bought months earlier. Before, it was fragile, something I tried to hide inside. Now it was fortified, the quiet that follows a siege being broken. The fallout was swift and absolute. Without the cabin to sell and without my house to commandeer, Evan's collapse finally met gravity. He lives now in a studio apartment above a garage 3 towns over. It isn't the image Linda wanted to project, but it's the reality he can afford. For the first time in his life, physics applies. My parents retreated. It's hard to maintain the illusion of a perfect family dynasty when neighbors watch police escort you off your daughter's driveway. The gossip wasn't about Evan's next venture. It was about the moving truck that had to back up. Their reputation, the asset they valued above all else, became the collateral damage of their entitlement. I stand in the center of my living room now. The furniture has arrived. A velvet sofa, a teak coffee table. The choices are mine. Echo sleeps in a sunbeam on the rug. I hold a cup of tea and watch the sunset bleed through the floor-to-ceiling glass. When I first bought this house, I was afraid of the windows. I thought visibility made me vulnerable. I thought if people could see in, they could break in. I was wrong. The glass doesn't make me weak. It gives me a vantage point. I can see everything coming, the storms, the seasons, the truth. I lost my family that Saturday morning, or rather, I lost the illusion that they would ever protect me. As I breathe air that belongs entirely to me, I realize I didn't lose a safety net. I cut dead weight. I place my hand against the cool glass and feel that familiar electric hum in my chest, the one I felt when I signed the deed. This time, it isn't fear. It's the steady vibration of a life that is finally structurally sound. I built a sanctuary. I defended it, and now I get to live in it. If this story resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, share it with friends who might need it, and comment below with your perspective or the key lesson you took away.